very much, Mr. Speaker. This is one occasion that I'm actually sad I have to rise in the House to speak on this issue. As I say, I normally begin my remarks with what an honour it is for me to rise on behalf of my constituents in Durham, on behalf of my experiences in the private sector, in the charitable space, and as many members of this House know, speak to the issues that affect the Canadian Armed Forces, their families, and our veterans. And as I said last week in this House, the Conservatives were going to be back here every day until the Liberals start to take some sense of ownership of their files, Mr. Speaker. This is the People's House. This is the House of Commons, where we are representing our constituents and the concerns of Canadians, be they veterans, family members, first responders, their families, who are outraged by this situation. I will say I'm dividing my time with the member from Brandis-Souris. Christopher Garnier is not a veteran, Mr. Speaker. He never served a day in uniform, yet he took the life of Catherine Campbell, who wore 2 uniforms of service for her community and her country. She was a police officer, Mr. Speaker, and in her spare time, she was also a volunteer firefighter. A young Canadian, we should be proud and should celebrate the fact that she dedicated so much of her life to serving others. Christopher Garnier snuffed out that life, Mr. Speaker, and he should be treated accordingly. He should be given no benefits from the federal government, Mr. Speaker, certainly not those that are safeguarded for veterans. We've talked on all sides of this House, and the member from Winnipeg Centre knows this. There's a sacred obligation to our veterans. My first response when I stood in this House was to echo the words of Sir Robert Borden and the profound duty we owe to our veterans. In fact, I've echoed the sentiment of World War I veteran who died in that conflict, Talbot Papineau, whose famous family now bears the name of the Prime Minister's seat, on the obligations we owe. From the moment someone joins the Canadian Armed Forces at 18, 19, 20 or older, till the end of their life, we owe them that obligation. And those seriously injured, that obligation includes supports, benefits, and treatment. Mr. Garnier is not one of those people, Mr. Speaker. And there's been a number of absolutely false arguments put forward by this government in their stubborn refusal to just do the right thing, acknowledge there was an error and rectify it. But Mr. Garnier, in September 2015, as the Superior Court of Nova Scotia has confirmed, killed Catherine Campbell and then desecrated her remains, Mr. Speaker. I won't go into the sordid details, but they're horrific. In December 2017, he was convicted of second-degree murder, and he was sentenced in August of this year for killing a Canadian, a fine Canadian. What is horrific as well to not only the family, but to veterans across the country, sometime ahead of his sentencing, he started receiving benefits from Veterans Affairs Canada. Benefits that this government's own documentation show wait times for assessment are getting past the 9-month mark on average, Mr. Speaker. So in many ways, Mr. Garnier was placed ahead of veterans who are waiting for operational stress injury support, mainly counseling, psychiatric counseling, peer support services, Mr. Speaker. How a convicted murderer who never served a day in his life received those benefits is a scandal. And the failure to own that scandal by the Minister of Veterans Affairs is shameful. And to suggest that privacy or other reasons are preventing the discussion, I'd invite anyone to see the coverage of the case in the Chronicle Herald newspaper or on CBC, Mr. Speaker, where Mr. Garnier's lawyer told the court that his client has PTSD from committing murder, where the father of the killer admits to the court that his son has PTSD from a murder. That PTSD has nothing to do with his father's service in the Canadian Armed Forces. And for the minister to suggest that I don't know the file, Mr. Speaker, is a joke. Yeah. Since I joined the Canadian Armed Forces at the age of 18 until this very day, I've either been in uniform or I've been working to support those in it, Mr. Speaker. And when I was minister, I admitted where we fell short and worked with veterans to make a plan to make it right. I never lied, I never misled, and I always read my briefings. And I will debate any member of that side of the House any day on any of the issues related to the Canadian Armed Forces and veterans. But what I will do now is tell them, because the minister, we know from the news, doesn't read reports, he shelves them, there is not a single program within Veterans Affairs that Mr. Garnier would be eligible for, or programs outside. I was happy as a new member of Parliament to visit Can Praxis in Rocky Mountain House, Alberta, which was trailblazing equine therapy for a veteran or first responder and a member of their family who were struggling. A dependent child, a spouse. There are some programs available for spouses, for dependent children, Mr. Speaker. We're not talking about any of those circumstances in the Garnier case. This is an adult, non-dependent who murdered someone. And I'm sure that murder and the horrific circumstances around it has upset his family. But that has nothing to do with the service related to that veteran, Mr. Speaker. That veteran, the father, needs as much support as we can provide. His adult, non-dependent child is not eligible for any programming. And the very fact that he can be accelerated before his judicial proceeding and sentences is even complete, he's receiving some benefits that some veterans are waiting for, is a travesty. What I'd like to see, instead of the minister hiding behind privacy when all Canadians can see this entire sordid story online or in the newspapers, I'd like him to take some ownership. A mistake was made where someone said there was eligibility when there was no eligibility. There is no legislative requirement for Mr. Garnier to get support. There's no privacy concerns that they can't discuss it. He is ineligible. In fact, if the father had committed this crime while he was in uniform, he would not be eligible for service or for treatment, Mr. Speaker. That's how black and white this issue is. And the very fact that the Liberals, once they craft a talking point, they won't move away from it when veterans and Canadians are asking them. Show some reality here. We're always going to have cases where we need to do better, where we find a veteran or their family has fallen through the cracks. Let's fix those cases, rebuild trust, and not erode the trust by showing veterans we're going to allow someone ineligible to access benefits faster than them. As the minister should know if he would read up, the permanent impairment allowance many veterans receive under the new Veterans Charter, which we increased the PIA supplement, that was the focus of my attention as minister. And a vast majority of veterans receiving the permanent impairment allowance have operational stress injuries. It's been something the Canadian Armed Forces has been struggling with. I talked about it on the 20th anniversary of the crash of Swissair, the first time I ever heard operational stress injury. That's why we were opening operational stress injury clinics, not administrative offices that people still don't use. It's amazing they're still talking about those issues. It shows they don't understand it, Mr. Speaker. So, as I said last week, if that minister showed some leadership, Mr. Speaker, I would rise in this House and thank him on behalf of my constituents, on behalf of veterans, to show that if a mistake is made within the department, he will own, acknowledge, and rectify that mistake. And if they don't, they will hear us every day because we are listening to Canadians. We are listening to military families and veterans who are discouraged, are disappointed, It's time for them to show ownership, Mr. Speaker. Stop this shameless treatment for Christopher Garnier.